Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Federation Hall. If you haven't met me, I'm David Sequeira, and I'm the person who, I'm the director of the Fiona and Sydney Maya Gallery, but also the person who has the privilege of putting together the Art Forum program. And before I introduce our guest speaker today, I do want to take a moment to invite you all to ground yourself in the deep knowledge that long before the VCA or the University of Melbourne was thought of, that for generations, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation practiced song and dance on this country. They shared stories, made paintings and sculptures. They practiced healing. And it's we don't take it lightly that we get to do what we do on this land. And it's with great joy and honour that I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So our guest speaker, Nusra Latif Qureshi. I'm so excited to have Nusra here. Nusra's practice is developed through an in-depth study of conventional South Asian painting techniques in conjunction with image manipulation softwares. Her work ranges from small, highly detailed paintings to large-scale digital prints and installations that engage with the visual histories of South Asian region and Australian culture, pulling apart and reconfiguring the found patterns to construct new narratives. While heavily referencing 17th century Mughal painting with its exquisite detail, she interjects contemporary images to create a dialogue that offers new insights into both the past and the present while maintaining a visually appealing aesthetic. Nusra is the recipient of the Bulgari Art Award, and her work has been shown in numerous national and international exhibitions, including The Shape of Time at the KunstHistorisches in Vienna, So Fine, Contemporary Women Artists Make Australian Art History at the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, the Smith College Museum of Art, Northampton, the San Francisco Asian Art Museum, Manchester Art Galleries, Cincinnati Art Centre, the National Gallery of Modern Art, Mumbai, the Fukuoka Asian Art Museum, Japan. Nusra's work will be shown in the Fiona and Sydney Maya Gallery later this year as part of the Paul Seltzer Prize, and her work is currently on show as part of Sharjah Biennial 15, Thinking Historically in the Present. Wherever you are, please make Nusra very, very welcome.
Thank you, David. I can never be as eloquent and graceful as you are. Thank you for your kind words. I'll begin by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded land of the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Australians and Indigenous persons from other places who are present here today. We can use the word past as a point of departure for this talk. Past that was once a lived moment. It is deeply tied to memory in the present. We can use other words to describe what I call the act of memory. For example, reminisce or recall. This act of remembrance plays a huge role in my art practice. In order to articulate this element, I use many devices. And I'll interject, I'll use images and I'll read from this and I'll describe a bit of the images that you see up on the screen at the same time. So one of these devices that I use and one of the strategies in my studio practice is the use of existing images that are sourced from a wide range of visual pasts. Some of these images are part of art historical narratives, though others are drifting in and out of the margins in the form of illustrative diagrams, maps, obsolete mechanical drawings, and natural history paintings. This use of marginally floating ephemera pops up in my recent installations, and we will talk about it later. I say this because I'm asking you to activate your memory later or bring it to the present. Other devices, as quite evident in this painting, are color, beauty, texture, beauty, which is not a very pleasant and popular device at the moment, but that is something I really hang on to with my dear life, to maintain a certain aesthetic, to keep it as visually alluring and pleasing and appealing. And then I can say the unpleasant things once you start looking at it. So I will be going into a little bit of detail about each of these strategies and devices. So the first one is layering, which is very obvious. And this is a very early work, one of the earlier ones that I made when I landed in the city about 22 years ago. So unless you have a very pressing question about a particular technique or title, most of the information is there in the slides, but hang on to your questions till a little bit later. But if there is something that you really want to know about, you can raise your hand. So here I'm sharing a very basic example of how this device of layering can occur by superimposing another image on a detailed and recognizable one. So the complexity can be increased by placement, obstruction, simplification, dissection, and removal of certain parts of some visual references. In this one, there are so many different sources. There is a reference from a Victorian compendium of gadgets, basically, that pastel silhouette that you see kind of in the lower middle left. That's some sort of telescope. Then there are details from Mughal paintings, that standing figure, whose details and features are obstructed by a bird in negative space. So this complex layering leads to quite interesting outcomes. And the most interesting part for me in studio is the play and options that might or might not lead to a complex narrative. And I choose to allocate weight and voice to each image, making them say things or just keep quiet. So this sort of knitting and editing happens quite a lot in my work, knowing when not to say what, though I cannot promise I do the same with my words. So this is again something that I started doing quite early on and found it extremely useful to address the absences and erasures in histories, especially South Asian history. I was born in Lahore and was surrounded by history in many ways, historical monuments, museums, moth-eaten archives, collections which were never accessible because the bureaucratic network would not allow you to access it just because they can stop you from accessing it. So absence and denial and a no, that has been there, which I had to deal with. And I still find it frustrating, but I found ways to access archives now of a lot of difficult collections. And I think the secret is never to fully describe what your intent is. Always say what they want to hear in your application. So yes, the absences and erasures, and they happen in many ways. And I want you to notice the flat silhouetted areas. So the photographs become just blank shapes that are overlapped. The image on the right, the photograph has kind of obliterated the detail of the painting on the left. And yes, they are painted. It's a very small painting, just about this big with lots of detail, which was part of my training in Lahore. And then this one, which is one of my favorites, it was supposed to be shown in Sharjah, but the collector chose to become unavailable after a certain point and did not let us borrow it for the biennial. So this painting uses layering in a really interesting way, and it was really hard to achieve. Again, a very small painting. The central panel has about 4 groups of men photographed around similar times in early 20th century or late 19th century in India. And I have allocated these codes of colors to each group. And one person from each group has been painted flat, and the rest are in outline. So one of the groups is roughly, let's say, Muslim. The other one would be the British or Christian presence. One is Sikh, and the other one is Hindu. So this allocation of colors is not random, and it's a very subjective use of color, as you would notice in a lot of artists' works, and I use color in an extremely subjective way as well. But then I try to pull in very popular instant associations into this use. Orange is a very identifiable color for right-wing extremist Hindu parties at the moment, but more traditionally and historically, it's a color worn by lots of sadhus or religious Hindu men. So there is that association. Then the green or turquoise is a very popular color with on very humble, small shrines, mausoleums, or graves, or houses, or sometimes mosques. So that's the choice for the Muslim group. And then the blue, the royal blue, the navy blue, that's a very European or British association for me. So that group has been rendered in blue. But technically it was extremely difficult to look for the details after 2 layers and try to figure out where the line is going and to paint it with a very tiny brush. So that's the challenge of painting, and it's very rewarding in the end. That's a little bit about layering, and the images on the right and left refer again to existing vocabulary or metaphors that exist in a certain culture in South Asia. So the use of a horse, which might refer to royalty or power, and then jewels, and then the armor on the left-hand side panel, and the strange device at the bottom, which was used as a support to balance the long barrel of a gun. And it was supported by a second person sitting in front of the shooter who would have it supported here, and this receptacle for the gun barrel would sit here, and the pointy ends of that device would sit at the bottom. So that roughly, or I guess very indirectly, talks about how people are used as fodder in war, used for political gain. So somebody else is being used for a politician's or a ruler's whims and objectives, and then discarded afterwards. And then another device or strategy that I use is fragmentation. Fragment, segment, remnant. an incomplete but not insignificant part of the whole. Here is a fascinating tool in the studio to deal with the weight of archives of massive layers of historical and visual data and of sifting through the remnants. The process leads to further fragmentation of poetry and also grand segments of presented, accepted, and recirculated histories, even though they are incomplete. So my strategy is to further fragment them and present a very incomplete account, which makes a new whole. If anybody has been interested in Ottoman textiles, you can probably recognize the fragmented tulip, which has been used in the right-hand panel as a whole, but it has been taken apart mostly in the left-hand panel. And this is another one where I have tried to make something so incomprehensible yet recognizable. About 50 or 60 bodies of women, fragments of their bodies, which have been painted so beautifully in Pahari paintings in 17th and 18th and 19th centuries India. Those paintings are quite remarkable in their simplicity. They do not have as much detail and ornament as in Mughal paintings or Persian paintings, but they offer something entirely honest, direct, and very human. And sometimes I think probably the only times where the desires and intentions of women have been articulated indirectly. A lot of those paintings are illustrations to poetry or poetic texts or other texts, more philosophical texts. So they become much more direct and free of dictation from a patron. And the artist is much freer to articulate subtle and more sensitive feelings. So those women's bodies are all piled up in one heap to make, almost destroy their beauty, but I think it did not work too well. And that is one of the things that I sort of try not to fight anymore, to fight with this intent or conscious effort to introduce beauty into my work, which I find an extremely powerful device. And I really don't understand why people are so offended by it. So it's not a luxury. That's what I can say to most people. It doesn't hurt to have or to having to look at beautiful things. So, but then it was my attempt coming closer to express something quite ugly that I had experienced, and thus the title, How Did Things Get to This Point, which is the most banal and bizarre kind of title I've used so far in any of the works. So moving on, leading to another device, mirroring or the mirror. I recently finished reading after my 4th attempt at it and was successful at it. The book, The Enchantress of Florence. Is that right? By Rushdie. And there he uses mirror, a person who is identical to one of the main characters, who is so amazingly beautiful that people or cities give way to her. They forget who they are and they just fall in love collectively with her person. And she's accompanied by a maid or her personal servant who is doing everything with her who looks exactly like her, but everybody assesses her to be slightly less beautiful. If you look closely, you will find that she's slightly less beautiful than the princess herself. So the mirror, it fascinates me how mirror or the device of mirroring can reveal so much in human nature. Despite this perplexing idea that whatever you see in a mirror is the inverse or it's the opposite of what is on the other side, but then which is the other side? That's what I'm fascinated by, which is the other side, just like Alice in Through the Looking Glass. So, though not the inspiration, but an apt illustration, Orwell's, and I quote, "All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others," serves as a lucrative visual device to comment on the imbalances we are dealt with every day. In my paintings, this distortion is subtle only if you pay attention. You will see the slightly stretched other half of the image. The unequal reflections and perhaps imagined, perhaps invented, but maybe it could be the real one. It all depends on where you stand, as Alice famously said in front of the looking glass. Here comes the cat. I intended to use a cat video, but then technically we can't include videos. So Alice says, "Oh kitty, how nice it would be if we could only get through into Looking Glass House. I'm sure it's got, oh, such beautiful things in it. Let's pretend there is a way of getting through into it somehow, kitty." So that fascination has been there always, the mirroring, what is on the other side, which is the true side, which is the reality. But the fun part is, as an artist, you can hop on either side whenever you feel like it. And that's the freedom that I enjoy the most in being an artist. The privilege, a true privilege to shift between realities and decide on where you want to look at it, not be on a certain side, but where you want to place yourself at a certain point and move. So in this image, which I think it is called The Unequal Reflection, and there are 2 paintings in it, and they are quite about that big. There is a slight stretch on one side, and I want you to notice the fish heads, which move slightly stretched on one side, but you can't tell which is the normal one, unless you're an extremely keen fishing person, and you can be found with a fishing rod on the weekends, but then it looks normal. So that's where I'm enjoying that space, the range of normality, the range of acceptable reality, which has become quite distorted, quite stretchy, quite rubbery at the moment. Especially when we look at what is fed into our social media feeds these days. And it hurts me a lot, and it kind of irritates me a lot when I see the videos where kids' videos, like little babies' videos, are made to speak or dance through using filters. They look like mini adults. They cannot possibly physically do that. But these videos have become so terribly popular on social media, and people are actually gulping them down as if they are the reality. So that is where I find a very scary prospect of what is the scope of distortion, how distorted things can be, and how much of that distortion is passed as the reality. That's what I'm very interested in exploring, and I keep coming back to that mirroring in my work for that very reason, to explore that particular distortion, how a thing of beauty can be modified so much into a very, very, very ugly copy and still pass as beautiful. And then the fragmentation happens in a different way in these paintings. The parts of female figure, the human body, the female body has been, I do not want to use this word, but chopped and pasted in different configurations to become something else. So the red part in this is from a very famous Pahari painting. It's turned upside down. It has been glued together in a different configuration. Okay, that leads to something slightly different. The face and my face. Self-portrait, self-portraiture is usually the outcome of a realization that the artist is their own best model. Patient, accommodating, quiet, available, and perhaps loyal. Sounds like a dating site, but. And these self-studies lead to interesting discoveries. For example, oh, my left eyebrow is straighter than the right one. Or, is this face lovable? How could anyone like this person? This might sound like a crisis in self-esteem and confidence. Though in a studio practice, every thought, feeling, and emotion has a place, has a scope, and it is up for engagement. And these works are part of that exercise as well. One of the, you can go in any direction, into infinite rabbit holes, any which way through this exploration. One of the subterranean explorations led to the area of self-perception in a post-9/11 Anglo city. Why is this face offensive in certain contexts without opening its mouth? What happened there today? Why did I get this treatment? What was that? And I've said all that a lot of times to myself. Should I try plastic surgery? I can probably afford it. And wouldn't it be an amazing artistic intervention? So this series was part of that kind of treating myself or bringing myself out of that trauma and trying to make sense of what the fuck is wrong with my face. I use the most direct way to portray myself in these works. I use photography instead of painting and set up spaces where I could only be with myself, using props, backdrops, and acquired expressions for confronting my own perceptions and my own biases. And I have to make it very clear that I was dealing here with my own perception of how I was treated, or sometimes going into a defensive mode even before I entered into a situation. So I was trying to tap into that space. I had acquired quite a lot of wigs, which were not black hair, and these white masks found from a craft store, and they had to be white. And you are all intelligent people here, so I will not go much into why they're white masks. And I tried to embellish the already shiny surface with sequins and stuff, and I acquired a whole lot of jewelry which I would never be able to wear at the normal pace throughout my life. And in this space, I tried to set up this very strange sort of confrontation with myself to work out, to act out everything that I thought was going wrong and what I felt offended by, and try to become someone acceptable, pass as a pleasant person showing my 18 teeth at the same time, because I never learned to smile like that. My kids have learned that. I don't know how, but they have. But this is something, you see that creepy smile in the left, that one, I can never do that. But I've forced myself to do it in this photo shoot. So this can make a few different configurations, this sort of presentations, the presentation of these works. And again, mirroring is happening in there as well. The top one is a direct, just a cut and inverse and repeat image. Nobody's face or body is that balanced or symmetrical. That's a more subtle kinder look at identity or layers of identity, and something again that I thought I can never be, pass as a very sophisticated, graceful woman. And that was again an interesting play with self-perception. So this one, glitch and decomposition, that looks at a different kind of work, mostly installations. This work was presented a couple of years ago in a solo show at Bulgari Art Gallery. It didn't turn out exactly how I wanted it, but it was a good exercise, and I just want you to focus on the details. That's what I'm interested in sharing. So there's a range of interventions, from irreverently punching and threading through old European oil paintings of great lands or great people, to respectfully translating, definitely not for the better, the delicate watercolors of Albert Namatjira. These interventions are an attempt to make sense of how the perspective changes in art history when one work is produced by the group in power and the other is produced by a people not even deemed humans in the constitutions until a certain time in history. I place this debate in the battleground of painted landscapes. After all, it was all about land grab. And still, the land is at stake. If it comes in cushioned cases and is polished metal, it is valuable. And if it is made of natural fiber or is on a cave face, it is primitive, thus expendable. We can blow them up to find more shiny metals. The threads melt, and in them are struck man-made ideas, vessels, chattels, and philosophies of desire. This was an installation I did to unpack the idea of landscape and how we in 21st century interact with it. What is it meant to be for us? And I imagined a space where, I'm not going to use the word nature, but natural elements, trees and shrubs and grasses and water take over. Man-made ugliness, man-made objects, greeds, desires. So there were lots of green strings. This was in Shepperton Art Museum last year in their beautiful window that faces the highway. And I used yellow to get the attention from a distance. and something that kind of shone through, and also was heavily inspired by Gerald Manning's The Plains, which talks about a shimmer of green and gold. I don't know if anyone has read that, but green and yellow and gold and blue, those sorts of ideas. And he keeps on staying and describing for paragraphs to end the impossibility of describing that distant hue and trying to figure out if it is greenish yellow or yellowish green or bluish green. So imagining that color to take over everything that is spread by human greed. And in that, I kind of transcribed or translated watercolors from the Hermannsburg School of Painting. They are beautiful watercolors, all tonal, and I did it as an exercise into sort of translating it into line, not improving, not making them better at all, just translating into a medium that I know best, line. So I looked at about 80 paintings and tried to just translate them into line on the wall in that museum. And in front of that, they were objects produced by humans. And I collect these things from all over the place. Most of them are rejected, like things that are not considered valuable. Most of them are not from antique shops, where there is a certain element, oh, it's still collectible, it's still desirable, thus valuable. Most of it comes from op shops or things that have become not desirable any longer, discarded. So I set up these little tableaus or spots of interest and then try to cover them with strands of green hued wool. So next device or strategy that I use is indexation. This use of marginally floating ephemera pops up in my recent installations, and we are talking about it now. You remember this sentence? I said it earlier at the beginning of my talk. I say this because I'm asking you to activate your memory later or bring it to some present. Is it possible to document human greed that plays such a huge part in every decision made in modern history? Can we count the number of humans lost for a cause in grief? Can we count the trees fell between 1857 and 1909 in human greed? Can we arrange the bodies of dead and abused children in a line and measure how long it grows for in units of human barbarity? So I try to make index, or indexation is a tool that I use to sort of chart out or spread out elements that are ignored, that are not valuable, but can lead to interesting introspection or thought. And I do it through a use of beauty, making it appealing, making it inviting, but not making it into a spectacle. So ideas and remembered events which are celebrated in museums, so bringing out or deconstructing the museum, thus using a vitrine without legs, again referring to, again bringing in language something which does not have legs, an idea that does not have legs. So kind of undermining the whole concept of perceived value, ascribed value to collections, to archives, to dead white men's collections or loots, and calling them irreplaceable, valuable cultural artifacts. And filling the vitrines with objects that have been sourced from sometimes even roadside and collected from op shops where things end up when they are no longer wanted. So I'll read a whole lot of words which might be a bit offensive to people, but you're all grown-ups, you will survive. Ideas and remembered events, real or imagined, from our surrounds. There are old, dusty, decomposing, or lovingly cared for volumes of books, royal artifacts, keepers of knowledge, libraries, archives, collections, heirlooms, hoards, stashes, stowaways, treasures, stacks, brashly branded publications about white men and their loops, or highly significant collections, gluttonous Instagram accounts, followers, likes, approvals of newest clothing and accessories, ugly sunglasses, the greed, the overwhelming but masked greed. All that needs to be looked at, questioned, called to order, called out for being utter rubbish, challenged for being oppressive, for catering to the privileged, for creating biases, for putting more equality in some plates and less in others. There is also banned material, substances or books, blacked out encyclopedic images, under the mattress print material, inverse images, one-man production houses on YouTube, simple souls not wanting attention in the form of thumbs up emojis. Those still working away because to them only work matters. We can replace work with art as well. Those who make things with hands, those who make safe spaces and not ravage the earth with mass-produced fast fashions, fast kitchens, fast foods, fast ideas and fast politics, fast words that still need to be processed, indexed, sifted through and analyzed. And how much nicer it would be if we talked less and did more. So I do try to do all that in art practice and not talk about it. And I find it sometimes unpleasant to share things in words. That is why I do art. And I try to shift away from my own known practices as well. And this particular installation was one such exercise where I very consciously tried not to paint, not even a single scrap of paper, and just use what I had been collecting for many, many years. And it was just sitting and waiting to be articulated, waiting to be included in something, waiting to be given, not given words, but just put in a context where it can speak for itself. So I moved into larger scale and things that I was uncomfortable working with and had to ask 5 different people to make and then argue with them to make them again so that they can look right and be the right size and be the right thickness, be the right shape, and to explain that no, it does not need legs. It has to sit on the ground. It has to sit on the floor so people come and look at it and are puzzled by the lack of legs. That it's not elevated up to them. And at the back of my mind, I'm always targeting or seeking the audience of kids who I aim to corrupt by introducing these subversive ideas. And because they get it, they don't want explanations and logical connections. They would ask interesting questions because they have already resolved the connection. So this vitrine has some kind of an assortment of things that represent or they are allocated different roles as they're not precious, but they are allocated this idea of preciousness or the desirable commodities that the colonizers wanted their ships full of and sail away. Silver, gold, pearls, spices, people, glass, jade, ivory, precious stones, their contentment, their cordoned off courtyards where white women could sit and read their Bible and do their embroidery and tapestry and watercolor painting. And dead furs, dead animals, things that were actually made extinct just because somebody wanted a particular specimen in their little glass box in their lounge room or drawing room. So this kind of fragmentation, the displacement, the removal of the precious and introduction of the ordinary or even the rejected is one of the ways I kind of stand up and counter and say, hey, look at this, this is valid too. This is my way of questioning all the injustice or some of the injustice in very subtle ways, keeping it beautiful and attractive. Again, kind of everything is tethered to the idea of it being beautiful and appealing and attractive without it being a spectacle or shocking. And then I guess we could conclude the talk with these words. Alice laughed. There is no use trying, she said. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. Thanks a lot.
Nusra, thank you so much for, well, firstly, congratulations on such an exquisite body of work, and thank you so much for your generosity. I'm wondering if anybody has a question for Nusra. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Nusra, for your beautiful talk. I wondered if you could talk more about the use of threading. It seems you're talking about devices and whether it's a pictorial device for dismantling the picture plane, but are there feminist dimensions to using thread? Just tell us more about the use of this kind of thread and wrapping and dismantling.
Sometimes I think that I do not have to say it, that it should be taken for granted that because I'm a woman, yes, it's coming from a feminist perspective. But then, yes, it is, and it took a long while for me to actually introduce fabric or textile or thread. And finding the freedom in it and finding the validation that was absent in certain other media, and the fluidity and possibility, which I'm thoroughly enjoying. And it lent itself so beautifully to certain ideas, that literal sort of just melting of certain images, that it's leaking, it's sort of just melting away to the floor, especially in this work. And I've tried to use that in certain other installations as well. And that is certainly a very conscious use of textiles and textile arts as a trope for saying things that are not easy with other elements or other media. And it's not, I found it's not restrictive. It's not, does not dictate. It can be made into anything, which is true of so many things that women do, even if we don't call them art yet. Like those insanely complex and well-computed laces, the lace making, the practice of embroidery, mind-blowingly complex projects which are still not acknowledged as art. There is still that naive divide between art and craft. Yeah, I hope it makes some sense.
Yeah, please, Siri.
Oh, yeah, I was just more of an observation that on the textile and the point art, it's more for me what I found is interesting is looking at earlier work and how the line comes out as red later on. When it's sort of like the 2D becomes deconstructed or fragmented, and it's really kind of like quite a clear continuation of that sense of line and fragmentation and space. And it's really nice to see that trajectory through this talk, which I hadn't really observed before. How that, yeah, how you sort of literally pulling it apart, not just in a two-dimensional space, but into a more three-dimensional space.
No, that's a great observation. Thanks for that. And yeah, it's one of the elements. I think one of the earliest elements that we were made to learn. It was extremely demanding. The exercise of drawing line. It was the first task we were supposed to do as students in learning Musaviri or miniature painting at National College of Arts. We had to use 5H, very sharp, pointy, needle sharp lead to draw a grid of lines and curves in that grid. And when I see that, I still have that exercise paper. I actually cannot see it, those lines, because they're that fine. And that's something that has stayed. That is something that I think alludes to intention. Because when you're drawing a line, you have to know where it's going, usually. So it has to have a very clear point of departure and a very clear point of conclusion. Tone is very different. Tone has a mind of its own and a space of its own, but line has to be planned. Line has to be not guided, but clarified before you actually draw it. That's how I see it.
We might conclude the session then, but really, Nusra, on behalf of everyone here and everybody in Zoom land, just thank you so much for taking us through all of the ideas and just, you know, really congratulations on such a stunning career, and we look forward to what you have coming up in the future. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.